Yo! Welcome back to One More Mana. My name's Derek, and today we're going to be looking back at another deck that was previously shown on the Command Center. And today's deck is Kagemaro, First to Suffer. Kagemaro is 3 a black and a black for a legendary demon spirit that has a bunch of really interesting text on it. It starts by saying both its power and its toughness are equal to the number of cards in your hand. Now the next line of text is where it really gets interesting. It says, pay a black and sacrifice Kagemaro, then all creatures get -X, -X, where X is the number of cards in your hand. This is really unique and really insane, because really other than maybe Child of Alara, there's no other commanders that are really a board wipe on a stick. Like, you have a commander that is a board wipe. And not only is it a board wipe, but it's one of those board wipes that gets around indestructible from giving it everything -X, -X. Now, obviously this isn't one-sided. When you sack it, all your creatures are going to die too, so you're getting rid of the entire board. So this makes just for a really interesting build. So in today's deck tech, what we're going to do is talk about, one, what goes into trying to build a deck that focuses so much around your commander being a board wipe, how that alters kind of the deck building statistics, and how we want to take full advantage of these board wipes, because although they're not one-sided, we want to make sure we get the most advantage and benefit the most from these board wipes. So just like all the other deck techs, I will go through each category card, show you exactly all the cards in the deck, and kind of pick out a few of my favorites. But I actually want to emphasize a few categories for this deck, because this commander is unique enough that it really does throw off deck building statistics. Now, because this commander serves as such a good source of removal, you always have access to a board wipe. So you're going to put in less board wipes than you otherwise would in another deck, because you already have access to it. And it kind of works the same for removal, where you can focus your removal in other areas. Creature removal, you always have access to. Now, obviously, you'll want some cheaper ones, because Kagemaro does cost a decent amount of mana, especially once the tax build up, and you can't just, count on always having him. So the cards that we normally dedicate more towards board wipes and removal, we dedicate more in this deck to card draw, mana ramp, and actually kind of a reanimation package to get more value out of Kagemaro. So speaking of card draw, there are 14 pure card draw spells in this deck, and even more if you count taking things from the graveyard to your hand, or even a number of cards that take basic lands from your library to your hand to grow your hand size. Because obviously with a card like this, you need to have a big hand. If you don't have a big hand, not only is his power and toughness very low, but it feels bad if you're only able to give everything -2, -2, -3, -3. If your opponent has a big creature, you can't do anything about it. So you want to make sure you always have a handful of cards. Now, this is to a limit. You're not really worried about having 20 cards in hand. You basically always want to have 6, 7, 8. The most cards you're ever going to need in hand to really wipe a board is maybe 10, 11, 12. If they have an Emrakul, you're going to need 13. But realistically, you're not going to have a bunch of 12, 13 power creatures running around everywhere. To really wipe the board, if you have 6 or 7 cards in hand, that should be plenty. These card draw spells include cards like Necropotence, Disciple of Bolus, Harvester of Souls. These are all amazing cards to fill your hand. Obviously, a card like Necropotence is just one of the most powerful cards in EDH. Paying 5 life to get 5 cards in hand, the price seems trivial. And one of the best things about this deck is, sometimes if you want a deck that wants to draw lots of cards, a lot of times there's draw triggers. As an example, a Nekusar deck loves drawing cards. You don't want Necropotence in there because you're not drawing the cards, you're just putting them in the hand. In this case, you only care about your hand size. You don't care how they get there. So this card is always good. It's even better in this deck. Now, I mentioned there's lots of ramp. You need to ramp hard. If you have any commander that costs more than 4, ramp should be one of the primary focuses of the deck. At least if the deck is centered around your commander. And this deck is unique in the sense that the deck's not really centered. You don't need the commander at all times. But when you need it, you need it. So always you want to have access to the amount of mana to be able to cast it and activate it at a moment's notice. These ramp spells include cards like Cryptghast, Arcana Revenant, Magus of the Coffers, Cabal Stronghold, and a number of just great ramp spells that are in black. Now in this particular build, we were a little bit more budget conscious, so we didn't put Urborg and Cabal Coffers in there. We do have the Cabal Stronghold, but obviously, if you just happen to have a Cabal Coffers, put it in with an Urborg. That's obviously a great way to ramp as well. Now there is a small reanimation package, including cards like Animate Dead and Palace Siege. Basically, the reason for these cards is kind of twofold. Cards like Palace Siege put cards from your graveyard back into your hand. This works to both recur creatures to get the effects more than once, but also to increase your hand size, which is just obviously something we want to do in this deck. And obviously a card like Animate Dead, it's a lot of high CMC spells, or your commander is a decently high CMC spell. So just be able to bring it back with a card like Animate Dead is relatively cheap and super easy to do, and it allows you to keep your engine going without having to spend as much mana. Alright, so now I'm going to go into the individual card categories. Now there are 29 creatures in this deck, which is very creature heavy and might seem strange for a commander that wants to wipe the board so much. Normally you think if you're wiping the board, you want to have no creatures so you don't have the downside of losing all your creatures. But instead of going for that, we're going to play a lot of creatures, but just benefit from these creatures dying. Cards like Grim Haruspex and Harvester of Souls are amazing in this strategy because, again, if we have a bunch of creatures out and we wipe the board, we get to refill our hand so fast, which is the key to recover from a board wipe. Being able to draw this many cards after a board wipe is key. We want to be able to just reload, refuel super fast, and leave all the opponents at a lower number of resources so we can outvalue them essentially and be able to refill our board fast. Pitiless Plunder also fits into this category. Whenever your creature you control dies, you get a treasure. Now, this is awesome because it's not going to draw you into more cards, but if you use your commander to wipe the board, you can have a whole bunch of extra mana to refuel. If you have a Pitiless Plunder and a Harvester of Souls out, and you choose to board wipe, you're going to end up with not only a whole bunch of cards in hand, you're going to end up with a whole bunch of mana to cast it all. Meaning, you set everyone else back and set yourself up to take command in that game. Now looking at the artifacts, we're going to run 14 artifacts, which again, having a lot of artifacts is very, very common in a monocolored deck. Artifacts work to make up for any deficiencies a monocolored deck might normally have. One of the first cards I'll talk about is Dingus Staff, which is an interesting card. You have to be very careful playing a card like this. If you see it, you need to make sure you are casting it at the right time. Whenever a creature card goes to the graveyard, it's going to deal that creature's controller 2 damage. Meaning, obviously if we have a whole bunch of creatures, we don't want to put that card out. But this is a great way to destroy token decks. If an opponent is going off and has a huge board, you hold this in hand, get it out, and if you're able to board wipe with your commander, you can just take somebody out of the game. So it's very situational, but it can be a really good card. This next card, Nihil's Spellbomb. This is actually a card I think just needs to go in more decks in general. This is an amazing card. There's so many graveyard strategies in EDH right now that essentially every deck needs to run Graveyard Hate, and in some instances, multiple types of Graveyard Hate. But this card actually doubles and has a second function in this deck that I love. I mentioned that we have some reanimation effects. So there are actually times we might let our commander go to the graveyard if we think the commander tax just might be too high. But what happens if we don't draw those reanimation spells? Well, the great backup is to actually exile our own graveyard to send our commander back to the command zone. It's not an ideal purpose, but I do love cards that have double value, that have different ways to use them, and a card like this is great because it is great in emergencies if you need to get your commander back to the command zone for any reason if you had let it go to the graveyard. And the last two should be no surprise, but cards like Thought Vessel and Venser's Journal. Obviously in a deck centered around where you want to have a lot of cards in hand, you need to have no maximum hand size. You cannot be in a situation where you're discarding down to hand size when the whole purpose is you want all these cards in hand. If an opponent does get an Eldrazi out, it's not going to do you any good with your commander if all of a sudden, oops, you have a maximum hand size of 7, it has 10 power, what are you going to do? Well, you need no maximum hand size. So these cards are crucial, and we do have multiple examples of this effect on cards in this deck. Looking at the enchantments, there are 9 enchantments. 2 cards I want to emphasize are Demonic Vigor and Unhallowed Pact. These cards are just perfect with our commander because we really want to be able to bring it out, sack it, kill everything, and then rebuild our board as fast as possible. What better way to do that than to have your commander just immediately come back? It's amazing because our commander can actually become a giant creature. It's not really something we emphasize much. It's not the when you think about this deck, you're not thinking about, oh, just commander damage. But that's a great thing. If you can board wipe and then your commander immediately comes back as a huge creature, you can just start hitting people in the face with, if you have all these cards in hand, with a lot of damage and commander damage attached. So these cards are great at just immediately starting to reset your board after the wipe. Looking at the sorceries, there's only 4. The card that I do kind of want to emphasize and kind of really emphasize its purpose is Decree of Pain. Now, I mentioned before, our commander is a board wipe, so why would we want other board wipes? Well, this is something that's really interesting and I think key to building a lot of commander decks is, although you should always have access to your commander, there's going to be times where you realistically won't, whether it's taxed out, if for some reason it ends up in a graveyard and you can't reanimate, for whatever reason, there can be a time that you don't have access to your commander. You always want to have redundant effects. Not only is Decree of Pain redundant in the sense it's a board wipe, but it's also going to allow you to draw so many cards to either rebuild real fast or have all these cards in hand for when you do get your commander out. It does everything this deck wants to do in one card, and it's something that, again, whenever you're building a deck, if you have a commander that has some type of unique effect that you are trying to build a deck around, try to find redundancies so that your deck doesn't have to get shut off if for whatever reason you don't have access to your commander. So looking at the instance, there are 5. The first one I really do want to emphasize in this deck is Death Denied. And this is just, it does everything you want it to do. I mentioned, again, you just want to keep getting cards to hand. This allows you to return basically however much mana you have, that many creatures to your hand from the graveyard. Which, it's so funny that so many decks, graveyard to battlefield recursion obviously seems like the most effective way. There are times that just bringing things back to your hand in this deck is going to be what you want to do instead. Now, might be my favorite card in the deck is Sudden Spoiling. This card is so cool. So it essentially turns all the creatures a target opponent controls into 0/2s without any abilities. Not only that, but it has Split Second. Basically, with the way Split Second works, you can decide, okay, I'm going to board wipe with my commander. Now, the best way to do this, and you can really catch people off guard, is you can have your commander only have a few cards in hand. And an opponent might just be going off, have these huge creatures everywhere. You choose to sack your commander, and then respond to it by playing Sudden Spoiling. Split Second's just going to end the stack, meaning it's going to resolve. There's very, very few things. I think Morph and maybe and mana abilities are about the only thing I could think of that can actually do something in regards to Split Second. This is basically a way to just guarantee that the entire player's board is going to be gone, and having the benefit that you don't really need that many cards in hand because it just turns all your opponent's creatures into abilityless 0/2s. This card is just perfect for this commander. And then we only have one Planeswalker, Liliana of the Dark Realms. Just a great card in general. It can allow you to find lands, it can work as removal, and if you get lucky enough, it can stick around. That ramp is insane if you get to this point, if you get the emblem. So, just a great card, and it just kind of works with what we want to do. We're running 37 lands. I had already mentioned Cabal Stronghold. It's a great ramp card. We're running a lot of basic swamps, so this card just works as an amazing source of ramp. The next one is Reliquary Tower. You're going to want a card like Reliquary Tower. You don't want to put a cap on how many cards you can have in hand. Whether you need to get rid of big creatures or you just want commander huge, you don't want a maximum hand size. And again, you want as many abilities and cards that allow you not to have that maximum hand size as possible. Also, I mentioned it earlier with lands. If you have Cabal Coffers and Urborg, put it in. Basically, if your deck has black and it's, in my opinion, 3 or less colors, put it in. But again, kind of a more budget conscious build, but don't forget it. Cabal Coffers, if you have it, play it. So that's going to do it for the basics of the deck. And now it is time for my favorite part, hopefully your favorite part. It's the game-winning step. It is, how are we going to win a game with this deck? Obviously, we're just wiping the board, and we don't just want to sit there with no creatures on the table. Our goal is not to bore everybody to death. We actually want to be able to kill them. So, how are we going to do that? So as you can probably tell from the deck tech, a lot of this deck is a very grindy style. You want to accrue value over time and make sure that with all these board wipes, you time them perfectly. You want to wipe that board at just the right time, and you want to make sure you benefit the most from it. So one of the more strange ways to win in this deck is actually with a card called Liliana's Contract. It's great in this deck just because it lets us draw cards, which is awesome. But in addition, we actually run 6 demons, and if you wanted to go heavier on demons, you could. But we have enough card draw and some tutor effects and graveyard recursion that getting 4 demons out really isn't that unrealistic. The next one is Exsanguinate. Basically any deck that runs black and likes to ramp is gonna run Exsanguinate. This card is absolutely amazing. The fact that you gain life equal to the amount of life lost in total is just mind-blowing. It is a way to turn that kind of like grindy game into a situation where all of a sudden all your opponents are either dead or extremely low on life and you have a ton of life. And because of your commander, even if everybody's trying to attack you and come back at you, you have ways to just wipe the board and keep yourself at that advantage. Exsanguinate, not much needs to be said about it. It is a great game-winning card. So probably my favorite way to win the game is Revel in Riches. I love janky you win the game cards, and this one works perfectly in this deck. So every time an opponent's creature dies, you get to get a treasure. We want to be able to wipe the board and then either draw a bunch of cards or have a bunch of mana so we can rebuild faster and take the most advantage of that board wipe. But you might just win the game by accident with this, especially in combination with a card like Pitiless Plunder, which I mentioned earlier. It's not that hard to get 10 treasures, and if it gets back to your turn, you win the game. Another great, potentially game ender in this deck is Gary, the Grey Merchant of Asphodel. Gary is amazing. He is basically in any deck that is mono black, and maybe even in some 2-color decks with black. It is just, he's so much value that he brings. So when he enters, each opponent loses life equal to your devotion to black, and then you gain life equal to life lost this way. It's that same wording that Exsanguinate has that makes it so ridiculous, in a very similar effect to Exsanguinate. It's just so good. And the thing is with mono black, black cards have so many mana symbols. Usually you need high devotion to black. There's so many cards that have 1, 2, 3 black mana symbols, and you can have just a decent board state, and Gary could just do so much damage. I underestimated this card the first time I saw it. I wasn't super impressed until I played it, and I realized it wins games. And then lastly, and this is probably gonna happen a lot of the time, just grinding the win out. You're just basically, you keep board wiping, you kind of control the board, you keep taking advantage of all these creatures dying, and you kind of just outvalue people throughout the course of the game and are able to, take the most advantage and then really just eke wins out. All right, well, thank you guys so much for checking out this deck tech. Again, make sure to subscribe on YouTube and Tapped Out. Please comment. Please tell me what you think we should add to the deck, what you like about the deck, maybe some different builds you have, different ideas you have for the deck. So thank you guys again for watching, and I will see you guys next time.